As the Scout law says, a scout is trustworthy, loyal. We could use some more loyalty, I will tell you that.
And guess who wasn't a scout? That's right, Donald Trump. We have breaking news tonight. The Washington Post reporting that President Trump and his advisors are privately discussing the possibility of replacing Attorney General Jeff Sessions. The Post is also reporting that the president could install a new Attorney General as a recess appointment during the August recess. That person would have the full powers of the Attorney General until the end of the year. Joining us now by phone, Robert Costa, one of the reporters on tonight's new breaking news from the Washington Post. Robert, there's also contained in the report the notion that this is all in order to get a new Attorney General to fire the special prosecutor and simply end that investigation. Does the White House and the president believe that that is possible?
That's important context, Lawrence. As I'm told by my top sources around the president and in the Republican Party, the president continues to feel vulnerable on the Russia probe because of the recusal by Attorney General Sessions. And that feeling has prompted some of his closest confidants and associates to start mulling the possibility of replacing the Attorney General. They do not have a clear-cut plan at this moment about who that would be or what that would look like, whether it would be a recess appointment or not. But the president continues to vent behind the scenes, and these discussions are ongoing.
Robert, is it your sense that this is a deliberate running this idea up the flagpole, as it were, through the Washington Post, see what Washington's reaction is tomorrow, see what congressional Republicans' reaction is this week?
Yes, it's part of an ongoing process that's emanating from the White House. You have it in terms of the president's tweets. He's tweeting today about beleaguered Attorney General Jeff Sessions. He made his comments last week to the New York Times. Now people in the president's inner circle are telling the Washington Post that even though they don't have an option yet of a replacement, there is active talk of replacing the Attorney General because of the president's frustration. So we just see this sentiment continuing to build in the Trump circle.
Robert Costa, thank you for joining us with this breaking news report. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're joined now by Josh Barro, senior editor for Business Insider and an MSNBC contributor, and Richard Painter, a professor of law at the University of Minnesota, who was chief ethics lawyer for President George W. Bush. Mr. Painter is the vice chair of the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. And Josh, so far, we're not hearing a big rush of Republicans coming forward saying this is outrageous, he can't do this.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've seen some. I mean, Susan Collins has said that it would be unacceptable for him to fire the special prosecutor. I mean, I think, one thing is that Republicans in the Senate are very focused on the health care bill today. But, I think at this point, the names that have been floated, who we might replace him with, Rudy Giuliani and Ted Cruz, neither of those makes a lot of sense. I have trouble imagining that.
Well, they agree. Rudy Giuliani and Ted Cruz have both said they don't want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, if he fired Sessions after 6 months, why would any other U.S. senator agree to take that job and then be at risk of being fired again? So what that says to me is that this is not an idea that has gotten really very far off the launching pad yet, if those are the sorts of names that they are talking about. I'm just a little bit mystified that he's so publicly focusing on Sessions right now. He's been grumbling about this for months, but really, it's Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, who appointed this special prosecutor. If Trump wanted the special prosecutor fired, the ordinary way for him to do that first would be to instruct Rosenstein, who appointed him and who is in charge of this because of Sessions' recusal, instruct him to fire him. And while he has complained a little bit about Rod Rosenstein, he really seems to be focusing most of his ire on Sessions, which I find weird, and it makes me suspect that there is something that has happened between the president and Sessions that is not all the stuff that we've seen publicly that we've known about for months, some other thing that he is upset about. Maybe, for example, maybe he's told Sessions he wants him to unrecuse and fire Mueller, and I would imagine that Sessions would have said no if he was asked to do that. That's one conceivable reason he'd be so upset. But it's weird that he's so focused on Sessions when really this is Rosenstein's doing.
Richard Painter, one of the things the president is facing is that in the statute enabling this special prosecutor, there is no provision for the president to order the Deputy Attorney General to fire him. That's not an order that that the Deputy Attorney General has to in any way carry out. But the president could fire the Deputy Attorney General who doesn't do it and keep having them go through some cycle. That would be, at the moment, a kind of unknown. How many of them would you have to fire to get to that spot? But if you just get rid of the Attorney General and during the August recess replace the Attorney General with a new Attorney General who's already agreed to do this for you, that seems like a way for the president to get it done.
Well, Nixon tried that, too. He had to go through 3 people until Robert Bork was willing to fire Archie Cox. But there was enormous backlash against that, and it ended up with another special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, being replaced and going on and doing the job that Archie Cox was doing. This is not going to work. This is a much more dangerous situation than Watergate. We have a foreign power that's conducted espionage inside the United States. President Trump has already fired the FBI director in connection with the Russia investigation. He told the Russian ambassador that in the Oval Office. We have Kellyanne Conway and other White House staff attacking Robert Mueller, really making lots of false statements about Robert Mueller and his staff. If the president orchestrates the firing of Robert Mueller, he has the power to do it, but he does not have the right to do that. The Congress is going to have to respond vigorously with its own investigation, demanding the reappointment of another special counsel, special prosecutor, and if the Republican Party does not get its act together on this, and I've been a Republican for 30 years, but I will say that this will be the end of the Republican Party. We cannot go down in history as the party that betrayed our country into the hands of Russia simply in order to win an election and then covered up the investigation through multiple firings of the FBI chief and now the special prosecutor. So I very much hope President Trump does not go down this road. It could be catastrophic for our country, I hope that Congress will hold him accountable.
Well, it's possible that Rush Limbaugh's audience might. Trump supporter telling Rush Limbaugh today, this is anecdotal, of course, but telling Rush Limbaugh that this could be a very bad move, getting rid of Jeff Sessions. Let's listen to this.
You're saying that Trump would lose some luster in your eyes if he gets rid of Sessions.
Yeah,
regardless who he replaces it with. You think that would be a bad move?
Yes, that would lose some luster, but it's beginning to look more and more like when you were saying it real well earlier, when in charge, be in charge. I'm seeing in Trump, I thought I saw a tough guy supposedly. I'm seeing a wimp beginning to show up, and he's beginning to bring in people.
Whoa! Let's just not skate right by that. You're beginning to see a wimp show up? What do you mean?
Well, you were talking about it earlier. If you're in charge of something, be in charge of it.
Oh, you mean the bystander comment that I made?
And fire those people, like you said early on. Get rid of those embeds up there. Go into that swamp and start doing some things, not sitting around sending out tweets about it.
Josh, maybe Donald Trump should listen to Rush Limbaugh instead of watching Fox News.
Well, I mean, the funny thing here, you would think that Trump's supporters who cared about, having an anti-immigration policy or some of the other things that Jeff Sessions stand for would be upset about his firing, and it would be a signal. Mickey Kaus was saying this weekend. It would be a signal that the Trump administration was becoming all about protecting Donald Trump and the policy initiatives that Jeff Sessions has, whatever you think about them. I mean, he was really out there on immigration restriction. He's trying to roll back some of the criminal justice reforms that other Republicans have wanted to do, more aggressive in the drug war, more aggressive in civil forfeitures, the police seizing assets from suspected criminals. All that stuff, those are Jeff Sessions' signature things. If you get rid of him and replace him with someone whose signature is protecting the president from prosecution, that's useful to you if you're Donald Trump or one of his relatives, but it's not useful to you if you're one of Donald Trump's nationalist supporters who actually cared about policy.
Yeah, Jeff Sessions has been a right-wing conservative for much longer than Donald Trump has been, and right. Rush Limbaugh's audience knows that.
Yeah.
Richard Painter and Josh Barro, thank you both for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.